Hi, Bill. Welcome to TwiceTold.
Hi, Praveen. Thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be with you.
The pleasure's all mine. Let me begin by introducing you to the idea behind TwiceTold. So, TwiceTold is an exchange between the author and the reader. Essentially, is that we are revisiting the book because, from your standpoint, revisiting that you authored this, you had a couple of variations of this book in your mind before you penned it down. I'm pretty sure there must have been various artifacts and versions of this book in your computer before your editor and publisher decided to pick this version. So for me, that's the time when the book was officially told. Now, I formed a set of impressions and ideas when I read it the first time. Now, when I'm discussing those ideas and impressions with you, I am rehashing, validating, and correcting some impressions and biases I may have formed. And I hope that this exchange also brings out some insights for you. And that's how Twice Told.
Great. Well, let's get to it. I'm excited to talk to you about this issue.
Fantastic, Bill. Thank you so much for that. I'll start off with my first question about your childhood.
Okay.
Tell me about your growing years.
Yeah, well, so I mean, I had kind of a happy-go-lucky childhood. Grew up in Massachusetts. As far as, because again, this is a book that's really as much about faith as it is about firearms. So faith-wise, I was raised nominally Catholic, but really kind of grew up agnostic and didn't really have any real religious convictions at all until my last year at university when I met some uh, evangelical Christians who seemed to be very joyous and they had a camaraderie and a connection to each other that I found very attractive at that time. I was a guy who liked to party a lot, and they were coming at life from a different direction, and I just found it winsome. And I fell in with them, and yeah. But I mean, honestly, nothing in my childhood. I didn't, first of all, grow up as a gun owner. There were no guns in my family. Although in scouting, we learned how to fire some weapons in the Boy Scouts. And I have friends who've hunted or, done target practice. All of that is legitimate. There's nothing wrong with any of that. You know, gun sports are in the Olympics. So I think, there's nothing, no one is certainly not set out to demonize having weapons for certain reasons. But my upbringing didn't really include guns like it does to a lot of American families, nor religion. And so then fast forward to, me as an older person realizing that these worlds are colliding in spiritual circles in the United States. That is to say, people who are avid churchgoers often are also arming themselves quite aggressively. And I found that very intriguing and quite disturbing, actually. That's sort of the genesis for the book.
Understood. Now, speaking about this person whom you mentioned in your book, who was John, who was carrying a firearm to church, was that the moment when you decided that you wanted to write about this, or?
Yes, absolutely, because that was really kind of a revelation for me. I had about 35 years of experience with evangelical Christianity. I was even a missionary in Europe for a while as a young man. And later, I was an elder at a church, and I was a worship leader at a large church in my home state of Massachusetts. But I had no idea that this gun culture was actually existing so just under the surface, but very, very widely held and embraced. And that evening, when we were practicing music for the following Sunday services, and my bass player, John, showed up with a 9 millimeter semi-automatic handgun. it blew my mind, Praveen. It just absolutely blew my mind. You know, I don't claim to be a Bible scholar or, anything like that. But I think that honestly, even if you read the Bible, and objectively, Jesus Christ, the figure of Jesus Christ, is a non-violent figure, Uh, there's no ambiguity there. And Christianity is a pacifist, nonviolent faith. At least that's how it was founded, you know. And so this idea that people were arming themselves with guns for self-protection and even bringing them into the church was something I had to investigate. It just was deeply troubling to me, and also deeply curious to me. Again, I've been an international journalist for 45 years. I had to figure out what was going on here. How did this start? How did it come to be that so many people of faith, have so many weapons, including serious weapons like the AR-15 military style assault rifle, which is sort of the gun of choice now in America? Why do people who claim to follow a religious figure whose nickname is the Prince of Peace arm themselves with these instruments? It really bothered me. I had to figure out what was going on.
I'm so happy that you decided to take the bull by its horns because
Yeah.
studying in a Catholic school, and for me, studying the Bible was a part of, though optional, but I chose to study it. And I agree with you about the Prince of Peace and the gospel of love thy neighbor. And when you see this now contrasted with evangelicals carrying firearms, and just doesn't make sense. And which is why your book is such a succinct and lucid explanation of how this is happening and why. One thing I enjoyed throughout your book was your choice of phrases and words, expressions that you used. One particular expression that you used was Jesus in his Sermon at the Mount blessed the wrong peacemakers. Could you elaborate about this, please?
Well, I mean, yeah, he was, a lot of his teaching sort of runs counter to our normal human instincts. So he was blessing, he was saying, blessed are the peacemakers, people who make peace. Blessed are the meek. I mean, in our culture today, we lift up those who are loud and obnoxious. Donald Trump, is beloved by many evangelical Christians. Why? I couldn't begin to tell you. Could not begin to tell you. Okay, because he's not reflecting Christian values as I understand them. Again, from reading Scripture. But anyway, yeah. I mean, look, Jesus could have, if he is who he says he was, if he was the Son of God and the Messiah, and he could have called upon a legion of angels to, set himself free from Roman captivity. He didn't have to be crucified. All of that stuff. He you know, uh, could have done something about it. Instead, he turned the other cheek, and that was the lesson that he tried to teach his followers. When we are confronted with violence, we don't answer it with more violence. We turn the other cheek. It's a radical faith in that respect, and it actually, in that time during the Roman Empire, was extremely radical to answer violence with nonviolence, and it's really a central part of what being a Christian is. So now we have people in this third millennia of Christianity who are really going completely in the other direction, with guns that are able to reduce a crowd of people into a mass of thrashing injured and dead. Again, I have yet to hear a sensible explanation of why this should be, especially for people of faith.
Understood. Now, in your time as a journalist 30 odd years ago, did you see evangelicals and their position with respect to firearms evolve and harden over these decades?
I didn't see it in real time, as I was myself a practicing evangelical. By the way, I will clarify, I am no longer an evangelical. I would be someone you might call an ex-evangelical, meaning someone who has a deep experience with that faith tradition, but I can no longer, in good faith, identify as an evangelical Christian. But during, in real time over the years, I just didn't see um, people carrying guns, but they were. I was just ignorant about that. So when I started to research the book, did a lot of reporting, and found that, yeah, even 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, in the 60s, um, there was uh, pacifism was the official sort of default stance of evangelical Christians, and entire denominations, that is to say, church traditions, were based on pacifism. And as the 60s gave way to the 70s, and Christians began to realize that they had some political power, and they began to be manipulated and inspired, to use that power in society. Everything shifted, and you really see then at that point a hard shift toward the political right, and with that, an emphasis on guns that had never been there previous.
Understood. One thing that's evident in your book, although you don't express it, is the politics of fear. So, how much do you think that fear has played into the evangelical mind, into them arming themselves to the teeth?
Oh, Praveen, it has everything to do with it. Honestly, fear fear is why people are arming themselves. It's why the gun industry is a $9 billion a year industry in the United States alone, because there's sort of the politics of fear, where evangelicals are being told over and over again that the outside world, in other words, the people who don't believe as they do, are out to get them in some way. And you'll hear this in evangelical circles, a sort of us versus them mentality. And this is manipulated by religious leaders to keep evangelical Christians in line, if you will. Just it sort of it almost is a way to manipulate people into obedience with church teachings, and also by the gun industry itself and by pro-gun force who want to sell weapons and make money. But it's honestly uh, really incompatible with faith. When you think about what it means to be a person of faith, fear doesn't really, enter that equation. If you believe something, whether it's Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism or any other number of religious faiths, including Christianity, you're trying to believe in something greater than yourself, and that sort of is supposed to chase fear out of our souls and out of our minds. So when people embrace guns and this gun culture, and they're afraid that somehow the government is going to burst into their homes and take away their Bibles, or this kind of irrational fear, but you hear it a lot in evangelical Christianity. It's really kind of the antithesis to faith itself. And that's what makes it so sad to me, because I think faith can be a beautiful thing. I still have very strong faith, just not in the evangelical tradition anymore. But, I don't see how you can reconcile carrying weapons around on your person. Again, not for hunting, not for target practice, but for protecting yourself. That means you're actually ready to take another human life. That's a big thing uh, for anybody, whether they are a religious person or not. And if you are a religious person, I challenge you to rethink that position, because that to me seems like a very strange place to land.
One thing that you've highlighted throughout and through the book are a series of contradictions. So the first contradiction being evangelicals claim to be pro-life, but they are perfectly comfortable carrying firearms, which aren't exactly pro-life. So how does this sit with them?
Well, I mean, it doesn't sit with there's incredible hypocrisy here, and I can say this as a longtime evangelical myself. Part of writing this book for me was to sort of call out my former faith tribe and confront them with the hypocrisy and complicity of being so much in the embrace of the gun culture. Why complicity? Because not only do white evangelical Christians own way more guns than any other subset of the US population, they also play an outsized role in the gun manufacturing industry itself. But most importantly, because they are such a political force, they form, Trump's base. MAGA is made up, very largely of white evangelical Christians. So they do have power and influence, and that power and influence they are using to block, common sense restrictions on guns that most of us say we want. And surveys will show this. So I think, that's where I find that's the piece of this, Praveen, that I find the most troubling, honestly. This this complicity that most Americans want universal background checks or a ban on these kind of military style assault rifles that we see used against our children in schools so many times and at shopping malls and other mass shootings. Uh, and white evangelical Christians they will not uh, allow their Second Amendment constitutional right to own a gun to be tampered with in any way. Why? Because they actually view that right as breathed by God, almost as though it were holy scripture, this right to carry a gun. So I think, when I look at white evangelicals, yeah, they're nominally pro-life when we talk about the abortion issue. But then there's this hypocritical pivot to guns that just makes no sense at all, and flies completely in the face of all those ethics and morals. Um, and they'll just, they cherry pick the Bible to find a couple of verses upon which to hang an entire firearms theology, if you will. And it's crazy to me anyway. I just can't justify it. I just don't understand what's going on there. But it's happening.
Second is his belief that these people can successfully defend themselves from the US government. Are you serious? This is the world's biggest superpower with a cache of weaponry you couldn't possibly imagine or even count. And do you think with your AR-15s, your nominal number of AR-15s, you could successfully defend yourself and your family?
Yeah, I mean, this is ridiculous, clearly. And this is an argument that I make a lot to my fellow, former evangelical friends. Um, look, I mean, you'll hear this argument a lot to justify why people need almost a small arsenal of weapons. And there are many Christians who have more than one gun in their homes. They carry them on their person. They have one in their car. They're ready for any situation. And the reason why they claim that that's, a proper approach to life is, this sort of harebrained idea, frankly, that they can counter the government. If, the Second Amendment to the Constitution um, talks about, a well-regulated militia that would be, ready to sort of, keep the peace in case the government got out of hand. Uh, the problem, of course, is that that was written when, the state-of-the-art firearm was a musket that you used, black powder to load, and it took you like, you had to load one bullet into the musket, fire it, and then it took you like a minute or two to reload. And again, to your point, how are we going to counter, uh, the force and might of the government, which has tanks and drones and nuclear warheads and submarines and attack helicopters and you know the list goes on and on. It really is laughable. If it, but it's it's not funny. I'm not laughing because it perpetuates this myth that somehow uh, the government is going to conspire against us, and when we can actually do something about it. I'm not sure that in with today's tools of modern warfare, we could do much about it. I'm sure a lot of us would fight. I certainly would resist tyranny, but to use that to prop up an entire gun culture, where we have more mass shootings in the United States than we have days of the year. We have a real problem, and we have to start looking at it open-minded and clear-eyed if we're ever going to, break this cycle of endless gun violence.
Does this thought never occur to most evangelicals that my children or I and my family could be victims of mass shooting anytime?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, but look, here's the thing about fear, and this is a recurrent theme in the book because it's just such a key aspect of all of this. We see fear being manipulated right now in our country, even from the Oval Office. President Trump is sending National Guard troops into American cities that don't need them. We actually, violent crime is at historic lows in the United States. And Trump's own FBI has, data, that shows this. And yet, we're being told that, our society is unraveling, and that troops need to come in to maintain order. That's just not true at all, right? So there's this sort of manipulation and use of fear to keep people kind of anxious. And yeah, I see this a lot. I mean, now evangelicals are wanting to harden schools so that you've got metal detectors and armed guards and all of the rest of it. What about just limiting access to these weapons? I mean, yeah, look, I've lived in Europe for about a third of my lifetime, and I'm back in Europe now. And you just don't see this kind of gun violence anywhere else in the world, not just in Europe, but anywhere else in the Europe. This is a uniquely American scourge, if you will. And we, we talk a lot about American exceptionalism. We claim, we beat our chests and we think that we're the greatest nation on earth. Oh, we're very exceptional, all right, but in all the wrong ways when it comes to this issue, where you just don't see this, and to the point where some of my European friends don't even want to come to the United States because they're afraid of, of guns and what might happen to them while on holiday. So again, this is really problematic in so many ways.
Understood. Have you had an opportunity to meet with Swiss citizens, given that Switzerland has the highest per capita firearms in Europe and they have virtually nothing to count by way of mass shootings and violent encounters like these?
Yeah, that's a very, Switzerland is a very interesting test case and sort of it's difficult almost to sort of figure out uh, why they manage to do so well when the United States does so poorly when it comes to gun violence. But, yes, people are trained to use guns, first of all. And, the laws regarding safe storage are very strong. This is a problem in the United States. We not only have so many guns in circulation, way more guns than citizens, by the way. We have more guns than any other country by far, about 120 firearms per 100 Americans. Uh, there's something called the Small Arms Survey, which actually coincidentally is run in Switzerland and provides a very good and accurate count of guns per capita around the world. So we've got 120 for every 100 Americans. That's more than twice the next country on the list, which is the Falkland Islands, with about 62 guns per 100 people. And Switzerland, again, safe storage. I've a real respect for the damage that guns can do and how they are meant to be stored and locked up. In the United States, so many people, because they have this irrational fear that they're of a home invasion or something like that. They will keep their gun loaded next to their bed or in the nightstand table. That's not how you're supposed to store a weapon. You lock up your gun, and then you have your gun is unloaded and your ammunition is locked up separately in another location. But they don't want to do that because they want to be able to grab it and use it immediately. And so there's a reason why deaths by you know gun accidents are the number one killers of children in the United States. More children die by mishandling guns that are kept like this, playing with them, their parents' weapons, and one little kid points it in jest at his brother or sister, and the next thing you know, you've got a tragedy. More children are dying of like that than are dying in car crashes. I mean, this is how serious this has become. You know, Switzerland doesn't, you know, handle firearms like that, so it's really maddening and troubling. Again, and let me just add one more thing while we're talking about guns in the home. Uh, the vast majority of gun deaths in the United States are not homicides, but suicides. We're running around 46,000 or so gun deaths per year in the United States, and you know, a good vast number of those are suicides. So if you have a gun in your home and you're having a bad time, or you're going through a rough spell, or you've been laid off, or your relationship has ended, and you're despondent, and you make an attempt with a firearm, the chances are that you're going to succeed. And look, I mean, it's just so awful in every respect. And I'll just mention one last thing, and then I'll pause. There is this myth of the good guy with the gun who will, you know, overpower the bad guy with the gun. And it is absolutely a myth. Very rarely does that happen. And yet it's a big motivator for why people have guns in their cars, in their homes, on their person as they, move through society. It's what happens far more frequently is that a bad guy, will overpower you physically and then use your own gun to harm you or kill you. And that happens a lot. And there's a reason why, when we have an active shooter situation, the police send dozens upon dozens of armed officers in body, armor, because it's not easy to, when a shooter is moving, your adrenaline is pumping, you haven't trained with your gun to use it in that kind of a setting. So, you're really kidding yourself. And as I write in the book, something that the National Rifle Association doesn't want you to know is that your home becomes more dangerous, not safer, the moment you bring a gun inside.
Incidentally, in Hinduism, there is an official mention in the scriptures that when you keep weapons at home, you tend to breed violence within the family. So, which is why weapons, be they swords and cutlasses or guns, they are deeply frowned upon from a religious aspect.
Yeah.
That they will, because people tend to then view through the web, see their life through the eyes of the weapon. You see solutions to everyday problems, including mental health crises, through a firearm.
Yeah, I mean, and so, Hindu society is far wiser than evangelical Christian society at this moment in time, honestly. And you're absolutely right. And, look, I mean, it's, yeah, once you have a gun, you kind of walk through situations in life, a little cocky, maybe a little arrogant, a little trigger happy. This happened. I mean, the trickling through of society at virtually every level is really hard to grasp. I mean, when a husband and a wife have an argument, if there's a gun in the home, that can become a homicide, and it often does. Because it's within reach, and one or the other grabs for it, and a situation that might have been diffused or could be handled with therapy or other other means becomes suddenly the medical examiner is called, and we've got a tragedy on our hands. It's just look, I something that really kind of compelled me, Praveen, as I was reporting and writing this book, again, as a longtime evangelical Christian myself, was you know, it feels to me like if you're a person of faith, and again, I don't care whether it's you're a Jew, a Muslim, a Hindu, a Buddhist, a Christian, you really ought to be sort of looking at ways to improve the world around you. I tell people Christians ought to take sort of the religious equivalent of the Hippocratic oath that doctors take, which is roughly paraphrasing, above all, do no harm. So if you're a person of faith, now you're sort of perpetuating this horrible gun crisis in our country. Not cool. It's just not cool at all. And you'll never convince me that you need an AR-15 military style assault rifle for anything. Uh, and yet these things are selling wildly.
Understood. Now, I wouldn't want to tar the entire faith, but are there bad faith actors among the faith who are endorsing firearms, perhaps incentivized by NRA?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, first of all, I mentioned earlier that evangelical Christians have an outsized role in the gun manufacturing industry. They actually run quite a few of the top gun making companies, excuse me. And their advertising is grotesque at times. I remember a couple of years ago on an Easter, one of the gun companies that actually made the some of the rifles that were used in the massacre of young children in Uvalde, Texas, a few years ago at that elementary school, um, advertised their guns on Easter Sunday with a media post, a social media post of an open Bible, and then there was a AR-15 military style assault rifle across, laying on the open Bible, and then there was a crucifix draped over all of that. And the post simply said, "He is risen," referring to Jesus Christ on Easter. With all of that imagery, it's just really crazy. And it got a lot of likes and reposts by evangelicals because faith and firearms have become sort of welded together in a very very strange way. But yeah, you see this quite often. You'll some of the members of Congress in Washington who are evangelical Christians are also very, very fervent supporters of gun rights. And Lauren Boebert, the representative from Colorado, recently introduced legislation that would make the AR-15 the official gun of the United States. And you'll see a lot of members of Congress who are sympathetic to that and to gun rights in general, wearing little lapel pins that show this little sort of like machine gun, right on their, they have the little American flag pin on one lapel, and on the other one they have the AR-15. It's pretty jarring imagery, honestly, to me anyway.
That image of an AR-15 superimposed against a Bible and a cross should have been sued for blasphemy. I
Yeah,
mean, to even think
yeah.
of this is grotesque at such a level. And how come there was no outrage over this? How dare you show Christianity in such poor light? Was there
I
no
think there,
criticism for it?
well, there was, of course, there were progressive Christians who objected, strenuously to this kind of imagery. And again, we've had a lot of school shootings. There's a lot of broken people out there. I have a friend who lost her daughter at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. We're coming up, December is always a sad month for her because that's when her daughter was killed at 6 years old. Um, and these are people who they see this stuff on in their social media feeds, and it just sort of triggers so much grief and outrage over and over again. And this is being done by, again, people of faith. How is that possible? I find that hard. So this is kind of why I really felt compelled to sort of pull the curtain back on this little known sort of nexus of faith and firearms and let people know what's really going on here. These are strange bedfellows indeed, guns and God.
Understood. Now, among the evangelicals, have you encountered faith leaders who are espousing against gun violence and acquiring or keeping guns?
There are a few, very few. The default position is that God gave us this right to own and carry weapons. It's a God-given right, and we ought to preserve it, at all costs. But there are a few other, voices pushing back. I'm thinking of a gentleman in particular called Shane Claiborne, who is still kind of claiming to be an evangelical, although honestly, I don't see him as an evangelical because he's just such a kind and warm-hearted and compassionate man. He's got a ministry in Philadelphia, and he and his partners collect weapons that are turned in to police, or sometimes they run their own sort of amnesty programs. They give uh, gift cards or cash to people in exchange for turning in their weapons. And then they turn these weapons into garden tools. They heat them up on very hot, portable furnaces and hammer them into, you know, tools that people can use to till the soil and grow vegetables. In so doing, almost literally beating swords into plowshares, to quote the famous Bible verse from the Old Testament book of Isaiah. I find that powerful and beautiful. There's a group of nuns. They're not evangelicals, but they're women of faith who are buying shares in some of the evangelical-owned gun manufacturing companies so that they can get a seat at the shareholder meetings and introduce, uh, you know, resolutions to try and make the works of those companies safer, to not market their guns to young people, and to try and make sure that safety mechanisms are given priority when they're manufacturing these weapons. Beautiful. I find that just sort of deliciously subversive, this idea that nuns would raise money, crowdfunding, and then buy enough shares to actually have a seat at the table.
Understood. Now, would a gun-loving evangelical ever venture into Claiborne's church? Would
Look, I,
they?
I think so. I think, look, I mean, as I tell people, because again, this is kind of a bleak issue, and I want to leave people with some hope. I myself am an optimist by nature, and a couple of things here. First of all, there are somewhere between 50 and 60 million white evangelicals in the United States. Again, that's why they have such political power. But they're not a monolith any more than any other cohort of America is. And I think that some evangelicals are persuadable when it comes to guns. And certainly not all evangelicals own guns, although, again, generally speaking, they own way more guns than any uh, other part of the population. But I think there are some who are weary of seeing these headlines and seeing these mass shootings and the bloodshed that we so regularly, are exposed to, on the evening news. And they want to change that narrative. And there are a few. And I think, for me, I approach this as a good friend of mine who's involved in some of this work says, one gun and one evangelical at a time.
Understood. Now, what are your thoughts on the biblical phenomena of rapture?
Okay, well, gee, thanks for tossing me a really easy question, Praveen. Yeah, okay, look, rapture is a concept in the New Testament. I think personally, it's very misunderstood. I think that evangelical Christians are deluding themselves into thinking that somehow in with a poof, they're going to be taken away off this planet and spared, all the difficulties that might happen at the end of time. There are many ways to interpret all this talk about rapture. Um, for me, a few things. I mean, obviously, we still are seeing people predicting uh, dates that this will occur, and then it doesn't occur, and which makes you wonder, what kind of prophets they are if they can't actually get the date right. But honestly, I find this dangerous as a theology, and this is a widely held theology among white evangelicals. But I think this idea that believers are going to be whisked away by Jesus before basically all hell breaks loose gives Christians a sort of an out to not care about the world they live in, to not care about the poor, to not care that migrants are being rounded up and arrested, and to not care that people who want to love who they want to love are being persecuted and enduring hatred, even to the point of hate crimes. To not care that our planet is warming, and with it, we're all in peril. But who cares? Because God's going to take us off this planet, and so it's not my problem. Why should I care about being a responsible human being? All of this stuff, I find it rubbish. And I think that it gives faith a bad name. And it runs counter in my mind to some of the biblical imperatives to love your neighbor and to care for each other and to care for this beautiful planet we've been given. We only have one, right? So let's take care of it and let's take care of each other.
Exactly the reason why I brought this up, because there's this deep and abiding sense of fatalism that most evangelicals believe they can't change society, or it's beyond their understanding or control. So why is this? Why and where did this sense of deep fatalism come into an otherwise positive and positivist religion?
Oh gosh, it's really hard to. I think it sort of came with the tilt to the hard right of evangelical Christians that again happened in the 70s and early 80s as they started to coalesce around people who were telling them what they wanted to hear. People like Ronald Reagan, who was one of the first to actually tap into this moral majority sort of religious right and just and again with that became a big circling of the wagons, and this is sort of where you start to see the us versus them mindset among evangelicals, that they are very much feeling vulnerable and feeling like they need to yeah, kind of circle the wagons and be very protective of themselves. And with that comes this kind of antisocial behavior, frankly, that again, I don't see a lot of Jesus in that kind of way of thinking, but that, maybe I'm missing something here, but I don't see how it lines up with the basic tenets of Christianity.
I like that fact that you used the term circling the wagons. Now, it's clear and evident that America was a settler colonial project, but at some point, the settler colonial project has to end and the settlers have to become citizens and natives. How long will we continue to exploit us versus them as a narrative? I mean, if this continues, there'll be nobody left standing. I mean,
Well,
especially with so many guns.
yeah, that's true. And again, honestly, one of the reasons why this is such an urgent crisis, this gun violence situation, is because we're seeing, like never before, a rise of Christian nationalism, which actually just a few short years ago was very sort of it wasn't mainstream like it is now. It was uh, now members of Trump's cabinet, embrace, this ideology that we are a Christian nation and that we have this sort of manifest destiny and we're blessed by God to, vanquish our enemies and all of it, right? And look, the one saving grace I see here is that, and my evangelical friends won't like this, but you know, numbers of evangelicals are slowly dwindling. The greatest, fastest growing part of the population, when you look at in terms of religious faith, are the people we call the nuns, not N-U-N-S like Catholic nuns, but N-O-N-E-S, the ones who have no particular religious convictions at all, agnostics, people who are sort of you know they might not be hostile towards religion, but they're not particularly beholden to it either. And this is the fastest growing part of the population. And those who identify as evangelical, the percentage is shrinking. And so I think there will become, there will come a time in the next 10 or 15 years when certainly, you will not see this kind of influence on society by white evangelicals like you see now. And I think that some of them know this. I think they see the writing on the wall, and I think that may be partially why some are clinging to their guns, because they're trying to sort of hang on, and some of this will feed those narratives of fear that we talked about earlier, fear that the authorities will crack down on their freedom to practice their religion and so forth. When actually I haven't seen this. I don't think anybody has. It's just an irrational fear that exists.
Now, it's understandable that Christianity is not a monolith, but is it possible that we could posit guns as a form of idolatry? And given that Christianity, no matter what, which denomination, always tends to denounce idolatry, so can we pass this as a universal precedent, saying that if you have a gun, you cannot be Christian? Sorry.
Well, I mean, people on the progressive side of the Christian faith argue this all the time that in fact guns are idols, and we have the Second Amendment, which allows us to own and carry a weapon. But there's also in the Old Testament the Second Commandment, which is that you should not, create for yourself gods, and arguably the gun has become an idol in many American households. It's the object that people put their faith and trust in, and there is this sort of, as I mentioned earlier, worship and reverence of the Second Amendment to the Constitution to the point where people believe that it actually was given to us by God. And once you have people sort of thinking that God has given me something, it's very, very difficult to disabuse them of any notions that maybe we ought to restrict access to these weapons, very, very difficult because then it becomes a religious freedom issue, and that's what it has become here. So we've got our work cut out for us in the United States, for sure.
Understood. Now, speaking about education as a means of eradicating fear, how is it that we can leverage education to reach out to evangelicals and say, we are not out here to get you as much as create a safe space for everybody to coexist? This is not us versus them, it's all of us together in this soup in a rapidly melting world.
I think that's a great point, Praveen, and I'm glad you mentioned it. Uh, gun violence advocates, and I'm now one of them myself, would and do continually emphasize that no one is out to disarm Americans. They do have this constitutional right, and the vast majority of gun owners are responsible people who do store their weapons safely and treat them with respect and don't hoard caches of weapons and so forth. So, again, we got to do something. We can't, whatever we're doing now isn't working. And I think it's just reassuring people over and over again that we're not out to take your guns away, but maybe we ought to, consider common sense gun restrictions that might, keep a gun out of the hands of somebody who, is going through a hard patch psychologically or, this kind of thing, screening and I mean, don't we all benefit from that? And I think it's hard to argue against those kinds of things. And we begin there, and then we see where we can go. Other countries have done this. For the book, I traveled to Scotland. The UK had its version of Sandy Hook in 1996, 30 years ago, and they cracked down and tightened access to most types of guns within a year. And in 30 years, they have not had a school shooting in the United Kingdom. So it can be done. Australia, New Zealand, other countries have followed suit, and the list is growing. So we can look to them for inspiration on how to get ourselves out of this mess.
Now, my next question is a bit of wishful projection, but what if the Second Amendment was revised to include access to healthcare, groceries, and education for all, just as much as guns?
Well, that would be fantastic, and I would be all for that. It's what we've learned, of course, is that it's really hard to amend the U.S. Constitution. It's not impossible. We've done it before, but it does take an enormous, collective will to change it. I think that probably that won't happen, but it seems like we should be able to find enough common willpower and yeah, goodwill to pass some laws that will keep us all safe. Because really, don't isn't that all what we want? I mean, don't we want our children to be able to come home from school and for our loved ones to, come back from shopping or whatever? Well,
Exactly. But what do you think are the challenges in passing through something like this? What might be the resistance to it?
Well, look, I mean, it's we have a mechanism for amending the Constitution, and it requires enormous. It takes years, decades, even. The last time it was done was a few decades ago. It's just not you don't see it very often. So I think that might be a bridge too far, quite honestly. But what I can see is to pass some laws that help tighten access to firearms, and that's a beginning. And then we can see what other thoughts occur, and perhaps when we see some impact in our society, and we see that fewer of us are going to funerals and laying to rest our loved ones, will our courage and our faith will build, and we'll be able to perhaps do something along the lines of what you are suggesting. But I think it's probably not something we're going to start with. Maybe we get there eventually.
Right. I understand why may not be possible because fear mongering yields political results, and those in positions of power are not going to give it up. Now, so my last question is going to be about at a grassroots level, what could you possibly do to create a dialogue? Because right now there is no dialogue. How do we try to rebuild a sense of community that we've now
Yeah,
seemingly lost?
well, that's great. I'm glad you asked that because again, my purpose in the book was twofold, honestly. It was first of all to pull back the curtain and reveal very little known, but very serious uh, interaction between, faith and firearms, and call out, people and confront them with this. That was job number one, but also to sort of offer an olive branch, if you will, to people and to start a dialogue. And I, as I write in the book, it's tempting for us to demonize those, uh, who don't feel the same way we do about guns and restrictions on gun access. It's so easy to demonize people, and then we get into our echo chambers and we wall ourselves off from each other, and then nothing ever happens. So again, I think finding ways to engage with people and have just one way that I suggest, and it's something I've been doing myself lately, is when I run into a religious person who has guns, I just ask them, you know, tell me a little bit more about this. What are you really afraid of? And just listen thoughtfully to what their fears are. That can actually bear fruit. And if we can be people of goodwill who just listen to each other more than we talk at each other, perhaps we'll get somewhere.
But how do we convince someone who believes that gay people are corrupting the moral fabric of the country, or that immigrants are in, inherently evil? How do we now convince them otherwise in a positive and a possibly convincing way?
I don't think you can. I hate to say it, and I'm not a cynic by nature, but when you're coming, if you're going to deny people their very humanity in your own mind, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to tell you, right? I mean, I think maybe the answer there is just to try and educate the rest of us to and raise our children to be true citizens of the world who really care about each other and care about our shared humanity, so that there's more of us than there are of them. Because I don't see how you're going to once hatred, takes root in your heart like that. I don't know how that's going to change, unfortunately. Um, so I just think we keep being the best versions of ourselves that we can be, and try and spread light and cheer, and see and let, I would say, as a Christian, let God do the rest of it.
Yes. I hope somewhere in the near future, a religious leader discovers a passage that becomes gospel truth, and miraculously everyone just drops down their guard and their weapons, hopefully.
Me too. That's a nice thought to keep alive, and a beautiful goal for us to all share. Yeah. Thank you,
Thank you
Praveen.
for this book, Will. This was, of course, it is a dark topic, but I'm glad you didn't end it on this negative note and cynical note. Hope is what ultimately keeps us alive, apart from food and air.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank
So
you.
here's hoping for the best. Thank you for your authorship, Bill. Thank you.
Thank, thanks, Praveen, for the conversation. I really appreciate it.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you.